There are stories from World War II that were erased before they were even written. Operations so secret, their names were never spoken aloud. In the smoke between fact and fiction, people disappeared, messages sang through silence, and the dead kept secrets the living never dared to ask. You're not supposed to be here. But now that you are, step carefully. Some truths weren't buried to be forgotten. They were buried to stay quiet. The wind howled across the snow-covered plateaus of Telemark, where shadows moved swiftly between pine trees and rocky outcrops. It was January 1943, and the German occupation of Norway had grown heavy-handed. The Nazis, determined to harness heavy water for their nuclear ambitions, fortified the Norsk hydro plant at Vemork. Few knew that in these remote valleys, a secret resistance had already begun to undermine them. They called themselves Ravnine, the Ravens, a clandestine cell of Norwegian patriots and teenagers led by an unlikely figure, Kari Ahmet, once a rising opera soprano from Oslo. With her career ended by war and her family taken by the Gestapo, she vanished into the wilderness and re-emerged as one of Norway's most elusive resistance leaders. Under the frozen cloak of night, she became a ghost among soldiers, a myth told in whispers around enemy campfires. Ahmet's method of command was unorthodox. Her recruits were skiers, poets, shepherds, and orphans. Her codes were embedded in song lyrics broadcasted over BBC Norwegian service, a line altered here, a stanza changed there, warning of raids, signaling drop points, or scheduling attacks. Their mission was sabotage, but also to delay. Every shipment of heavy water slowed, every rail sabotaged, was another breath for the Allies. It was under the cover of darkness that Ravnine launched Operation Black Wing, a mission to cripple the Vemork facility. A team of 6, including 2 siblings aged 16 and 18, skied for 3 days through frozen blizzards. Led by Ahmet herself, they avoided Luftwaffe patrols using routes only known to locals and ancient Sami trails. Their gear was homemade, snowshoes bound with moose sinew, boots patched with whale leather, and explosives smuggled in barrels marked as sheep lard. The team's saboteur was Henrik Stjøholt, a former horologist turned demolition expert. He crafted timers from gutted wristwatches and old phonograph parts. "Time," he used to mutter, "must be our weapon, not theirs." His devices ticked not with gears but with icy precision, designed to mimic the factory's own rhythm so no one would suspect a thing until the final second. On February 8, 1943, the team infiltrated the plant through an old maintenance tunnel under the cliff. It was a perilous descent, with ice-coated ladders and dripping stone corridors barely lit by carbide lamps. At precisely 3:47, Stjøholt's devices activated. The resulting explosions destroyed key electrolysis chambers and cracked the transport pipes carrying the precious heavy water. Flames erupted, but the team was already gone, swallowed by the night, the snow, and the myths that would follow. The Germans were enraged. They hunted the woman ghost with bloodhounds and bribes, but no one in Telemark would speak. Locals knew Kari by many names: Snoros, the choir, the white voice. They said she once sang in a village square during a blackout to calm 100 children hiding from Luftwaffe bombers. Others claimed she skied past a Nazi convoy at dawn, humming Schubert, her rifle slung across her back like a cello. In March 1943, a Gestapo convoy intercepted a sled courier near Rjukan. In his parka lining was a fragment of sheet music, Mozart's Lacrimosa, annotated with strange markings. It was handed over to German codebreakers in Oslo, who dismissed it as artistic nonsense. What they failed to see was the subtle layering of cipher, a musical enigma. Each mark corresponded to a drop site, and the tempo notations told the days of movement. By mid-1944, the Ravnine had grown from 6 to over 40 operatives, aided by supplies from the British SOE and airdropped messages from Swedish allies. Kari's group coordinated attacks on German convoys, bombed remote weather stations used by the Luftwaffe, and disrupted communication lines vital to troop movements across Scandinavia. Her leadership was never recorded officially by the Allies. She didn't want medals. She wanted liberation. That summer, a young British officer named Richard Penfold, posing as a botanist, made contact with Ravnine. He described Kari as haunted, brilliant, and colder than the ice she commanded. They planned an operation to intercept a V-2 transport moving through Trondheim. It would be Carey's final mission. In September 1944, during the mission near the fjords of Trondelag, they were ambushed. The Germans had cracked a low-level courier's code, not one of Carey's compositions. The firefight was brief and brutal. Penfold survived with a bullet in his shoulder. Carey was last seen retreating through the mist, clutching her wounded violin case. No body was ever found. Only rumors. That she was captured and executed. That she lived on in Sweden. That she joined another front under a new name. In 1962, a woman's skeleton was found in a collapsed hunter's cabin near the Sweden border. Wrapped in oilskin was a music book. Inside, the last entry read, "Let the snow remember what men forget." Today, deep in the National Archives of Norway, there is a single reel of reel-to-reel audio labeled Project Raven. It contains a haunting soprano aria, broadcast faintly during a BBC wartime show in 1943. Musicologists say the piece doesn't exist in any known opera. But within its shifting melody, historians now believe lies a story, a warning, a triumph, a code. The voice is clear, defiant, unmistakable. And in Telemark, the old say that when the snow falls silently before the spring, Carey Ahmet still sings. Before the world called it a global war, Shanghai had already burned. In the sultry August heat of 1937, as the rest of the world turned its gaze elsewhere, Japan and China clashed in a brutal urban siege that would foreshadow the horrors to come. This was the Battle of Shanghai, and among its forgotten embers walked Dr. Hiroko Tanaka, a woman caught in the middle of a war that challenged every part of who she was. Born in Oakland, California, to second-generation Japanese immigrants, Hiroko had graduated from Stanford with honors in medicine. In 1936, driven by a longing to discover her cultural roots and inspired by the work of the Red Cross, she volunteered at an international hospital in Shanghai's French Concession. When the first Japanese shells fell on Jiabei district, she was preparing bandages, not battle plans. Shanghai was no stranger to violence. A patchwork of foreign-controlled enclaves and Chinese districts, it stood like a pressure cooker ready to burst. On August 13, 1937, it did. The Imperial Japanese Army launched an assault against Chinese nationalist forces dug into the city's northern districts. Tanks rolled down Nanjing Road. Bombers darkened the sky. Fires consumed entire neighborhoods. The hospital where Hiroko worked, housed in a refurbished Protestant church, became a makeshift sanctuary. Wounded civilians, Chinese soldiers, foreign journalists, all poured in, often dragged on wooden carts or rickshaws. Supplies dwindled. The morgue overflowed. Still, she worked through the nights, the only Japanese face in a sea of pain. Whispers followed her. Is she a spy? Why does she help us? Can she be trusted? To many, her heritage painted her an enemy. But Hiroko remained silent. Her hands stitched flesh and soot, not politics. One evening, a mortar strike shattered the hospital's western wing. 3 nurses were killed instantly. Amid the dust, a courier named Lin Gao stumbled in with shrapnel wounds. With him was a satchel of coded papers meant for Chinese command. Knowing the risk, Hiroko hid the documents in an 4 cabinet and treated him. She later smuggled the satchel through the international settlement to a journalist contact, Malcolm Greaves, an eccentric Brit who filed anonymous dispatches for the Times under the name Red Ink. It was the first time she crossed the line from healer to operative. The siege stretched into months. Streets became trenches. The Suzhou Creek ran black with oil and blood. The Japanese bombed without discrimination. In late October, a bomb struck a crowded marketplace in Honko, killing hundreds. Hiroko was found in the rubble hours later, clutching a child with a broken spine. Her back had been burned by debris, but she refused treatment until the child was safe. Despite the chaos, Hiroko kept a meticulous diary, often scribbled in the dark beneath her hospital cot. Her entries described not only injuries but faces, voices, smells, the acidic tang of smoke, the sound of steel cracking concrete, the 1,000-yard stares of boys turned soldiers. But what stood out most were her questions. Asterisk, what is a nation, if not its people? Asterisk. Asterisk, when your hands are covered in blood, does the color matter? Asterisk. In November, the Japanese pushed deeper into Chinese defenses. Rumors spread of an incoming naval bombardment. Foreign concessions evacuated. But Hiroko stayed. She helped relocate the hospital to a river barge on the Huangpu. Patients were laid between crates of morphine and rice. At night, the boat drifted past burning warehouses, past bloated bodies in the water. One night, someone fired a flare. A Japanese gunboat responded with machine gun fire. Hiroko threw herself atop a wounded man and was grazed in the thigh. It was during this time she was approached by a Chinese resistance cell calling themselves the River Dogs. They had learned of her connection to Greaves and her knowledge of Japanese troop patterns, overheard through wounded soldiers and intercepted radio fragments. They wanted her to deliver a map, one she would have to draw by memory, showing artillery locations near the Bund. She agreed. Disguised as a French nun, Hiroko crossed checkpoints with a map sewn into her corset lining. She met Greaves at the ruins of a Catholic school near WWII. He took the map without a word and left a small metal locket in her hand. Inside was a sliver of rice paper. Asterisk, from one exile to another. Truth survives. Asterisk. By December, Shanghai had fallen. The city was reduced to husks and ashes. Japanese forces occupied most districts. The hospital was shut down. Red Cross personnel were expelled or arrested. Hiroko vanished. Years later, in 1946, a box arrived at the Red Cross headquarters in Geneva. Inside was a scorched medical bag, a journal wrapped in a silk sash, and a faded photograph. Hiroko, Greaves, and 3 nurses, all smiling in front of the old church hospital. No return address. No explanation. It wasn't until 1991, when the journal was translated and studied, that her story emerged. The entries stopped on December 6, 1937. The final passage read, Asterisk, I have no country, no flag. Only these hands. If they are used to heal, I remain human. If they are used to hurt, then I am lost. Tonight, I must choose. Asterisk. Dr. Hiroko Tanaka was never seen again. Some say she was executed as a traitor. Others believe she fled to Chongqing with the resistance. A few conspiracy theorists claim she reappeared decades later as a Japanese peace activist in Kyoto. No theory was ever confirmed. But in a small museum in Shanghai, under cracked glass, her medical badge remains, name barely legible, stained by blood and soot, the only proof that she walked the fire-lined streets and tried, in her way, to make peace with a world torn apart. Warsaw in 1943 was a city carved in half. On one side, German soldiers marched beneath banners of red and black. On the other, the Jews of the ghetto endured starvation, deportation, and death. But beneath the broken cobblestones and behind cracked shutters, a different war was being waged. Among those fighting it was Smol Zawodzki, a man few outside his district ever noticed, a quiet, elderly clockmaker whose tiny shop on Nowolipki Street hid a workshop of revolutionary resistance. Smol was 62, with stooped shoulders and thick glasses that magnified his pale, sleepless eyes. He spoke rarely and smiled even less. Yet for over 30 years, the citizens of Warsaw had come to his shop to fix wristwatches, grandfather clocks, and musical boxes. He had a gentle touch and an ear for rhythm, tuning mechanisms until they ticked like birdsong. But since the Nazi occupation, his tools had taken on a different purpose. What once repaired timepieces now built destruction. When the Germans walled off the Warsaw ghetto in 1940, Smol's home and shop were swallowed by stone. His wife, Miriam, had already died of pneumonia the winter before, and his son Jacob, a violinist, had fled east and vanished. Smol stayed behind. He closed his shop for business and opened it for survival and resistance. Through the Jewish Combat Organization, OB, Smol was contacted by Marek Edelstein, a student-turned-insurgent. The resistance lacked arms and ammunition but had access to captured explosives and metal scraps. They needed timers for sabotage and fuses that could be built from common objects. They needed someone who understood precision. Small said nothing. He only went to his bench, wound the spring of a battered travel clock, and began to design. His workshop, no larger than a bedroom, became a cathedral of mechanical secrets. Typewriter keys became detonator switches. Old radios, stripped of parts, yielded copper coils for electric triggers. He hollowed out clock faces to conceal blueprints and instructions, slipped messages behind gear plates, and taught young couriers how to disassemble and reassemble traps so small they could fit inside a tobacco tin. Small's most ingenious creation was the Nightingale, a silent time-delay fuse. Built from phonograph needles and a rotating escapement, it made no sound, ticking invisibly for up to 5 hours before triggering. Resistance fighters used it to ignite Molotov cocktails behind German barracks, to time grenades left in supply carts, to detonate false alarms that drew troops away from actual ambushes. But he did more than build tools. He passed on his craft to a 12-year-old girl named Hava, whose parents were shot in front of the Judenrat offices. To a former baker, Isaac, whose fingers trembled too much to bake bread but could still thread wires. Small became a mentor to those with nothing left but the desire to fight back, even in death. On April 19, 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising began. German SS units entered the ghetto expecting to liquidate the remaining population within 3 days. Instead, they were met with gunfire, explosives, and a network of tunnels and traps woven through the ruins like veins. Small's creations lit the way. In one street ambush, a German tank was disabled by a mine made from a broken mantle clock and scrap shrapnel, one of Small's earliest field devices. In another, a time-delayed charge destroyed a fuel cache in a commandeered synagogue, luring German troops into a trap rigged with booby-trapped typewriters and sewing machines. The ghetto held for nearly a month. Small remained in his workshop, even as smoke poured through the streets. He refused evacuation, insisting he was too old to run, too slow to hide, but not too useless to matter. On the 11th day, with German troops burning buildings street by street, Hava and 2 others returned to the shop to retrieve Small's final invention, something he called simply the bell. No one knew exactly what it was. The 3 fighters returned with a small iron box, disguised as an alarm chime, and a folded piece of paper bearing no instructions, only a quote in Yiddish, asterisk, "Let the world hear what they buried alive." Asterisk later that week, deep in a German command bunker outside Warsaw, an explosion ripped through the communication hub. Investigators discovered an ordinary bell casing, melted from within. The internal mechanism had been a spring-triggered amplifier detonator, activated by heat and vibration. It was Small's last message, a bomb that rang only when trampled on by heavy boots. Small was never found. Some believe he perished when his shop collapsed. Others think he escaped through the sewers and died elsewhere, anonymous and forgotten. A few even claim he became part of the Polish Home Army, using false papers to continue his craft until the fall of Berlin. There is no proof. But in 1947, a Polish soldier cleaning out the ruins of Nowolipki Street discovered a rusted box sealed behind a clock face in the wall. Inside were hundreds of yellowed schematics, dozens of tiny springs, a magnifying lens, and a photograph. Small, Miriam, and Jacob, sitting on a park bench, frozen in time. Today, a small museum in Warsaw's Praga district hosts a replica of Small's workshop. In its center is a glass case holding his last working device, a pocket watch that ticks backward. No one knows why he built it. Some say it was symbolic, a wish to turn back time. Others believe it was a test, a challenge to see who was paying attention. Above the doorway hangs a plaque, engraved with Small's own words, found scribbled in the margin of one of his designs. Asterisk, time is not the enemy. Silence is. Asterisk. Clara Belmont stepped onto the stage at the Théâtre de la République in Lyon, the soles of her leather shoes worn thin, her nerves steadied not by practice, but by necessity. The room was full, a rare gathering of bourgeois French civilians, German officers, and Vichy officials pretending culture still reigned while war devoured Europe outside. The grand piano, black lacquered and recently tuned, stood waiting beneath the gaslights. Clara adjusted her seat. Her fingers hovered. Then she played. To the trained ear, it was Debussy. But to a very specific few, resistance leaders scattered throughout southern France, it was a message. Coded instructions hidden in trills, missed beats, and unnatural modulations. Clara Belmont was not just a concert pianist. She was a field agent of the British Special Operations Executive, embedded within Vichy France under the alias Claire Baudin. Her mission, to coordinate weapons drops, courier movements, and sabotage efforts using music. Clara had grown up in Brighton, daughter of a French music teacher and an English naval officer. Fluent in both languages and classically trained at the Royal Academy of Music, she was recruited into the SOE after performing at a charity gala attended by a senior British intelligence officer. Her gift for mimicry, in music and dialect, was noted. Within 6 months, she was training in Scotland, learning Morse code, radio transmission, and the delicate art of dead drops. But her true specialty was composition. The SOE called it auditory ciphercraft, a method of encoding information within musical performance. Every misplayed note, every retardando, every flourish of the pedal was intentional. Clara could tell a resistance cell to relocate, warn of an impending raid, or confirm an airdrop by slightly altering the timing of a Chopin nocturne. To the unknowing, it was artistic interpretation. To the resistance, it was life or death. Her piano recitals were arranged by a sympathetic conductor, Monsieur Leclerc, who ran a Philharmonic Society tolerated by the occupying forces. German officers often attended, lured by the charm of European high culture. Leclerc would send word to resistance contacts, La Demoiselle Jo Demain. And Clara would play. Each piece was chosen carefully. A Schubert impromptu meant safe passage. A Mozart sonata in C major confirmed explosives in the rail yard. But the most important messages were embedded in her original compositions, variations on familiar works, slightly warped. One such piece, Reverie pour la Nuit 33, included a fugue whose counterpoint formed a map grid when plotted on a musical staff. A resistance courier named Yves translated the notes into coordinates and recovered a crate of stolen Enigma machine components buried in a forest near Grenoble. Clara kept her cover by being unassuming. She lived in a modest apartment above a bakery. She taught piano to the daughters of collaborationist families, feigning smiles and complimenting pastries she never ate. But her eyes always watched. Her ears always listened. The war had taken her brother in Dunkirk and her fiancé in North Africa. She had nothing left to lose, only a cause to uphold. In the spring of 1944, a new SOE directive arrived: coordinate with the Maquis to sabotage rail lines before D-Day. The window was tight. The Germans had increased patrols. Clara composed a new piece, Oiseau de Minuit, a nocturne filled with dissonance and strange pauses. Its performance was scheduled for June 2nd in Lyon, and within its melodies, a timeline was hidden. Night bird, strike before dawn, the music whispered. Cut the tracks on the 6th. The Germans suspected nothing, until the sabotage succeeded. A freight train carrying tanks to Normandy was derailed in the Ardèche. Tracks exploded. Tunnels collapsed. The SS responded with fury. 5 Maquis fighters were captured and tortured. One gave up a name, Claire Baudin. The Gestapo raided the conservatory Clara used as a teaching space. She wasn't there. She was hiding in the crypt beneath a ruined church in Fourvière, her piano replaced by a rusted harmonium, the sound hollow but adequate. A courier named Juliette delivered the warning. Clara had hours to escape to Switzerland. But Clara didn't run. On June 5th, she returned to the Théâtre de la République, announced a farewell recital, and insisted it be open to the public. A final gift, she told Leclerc. The hall filled once more. This time, she wore black silk and no gloves. A German officer sat in the front row, revolver at his side. Clara bowed, sat, and began to play her most defiant work yet, Hummingbird Variations, a set of 7 interconnected pieces written in 5/4 time, rare, unsteady, impossible to hum, and filled with chaotic motifs that mirrored Allied invasion points. She played for nearly 30 minutes, eyes closed, fingers blistered, the melody rising into something beyond music, A message not just to her comrades but to the enemy. Asterisk, you have ears but do not hear. You have eyes but do not see. Asterisk. She ended on a staccato G-sharp, stood, and bowed. She was arrested on stage. Clara was interrogated for days. She said nothing. Her fingers were broken on the third day. She was transferred to Montluc prison. On July 8, she was taken to an undisclosed location and executed. Her grave, if it exists, was never found. But her music survived. Leclerc had recorded the performance of Hummingbird variations using an illicit wire recorder smuggled by the resistance. After the war, the tape was delivered to London, where British cryptographers decrypted its embedded signals and confirmed Clara's final act had set in motion a chain of attacks that delayed German reinforcements to Normandy by at least 3 days. Today, the original manuscript of Hummingbird variations is preserved in the British Library, ink faded, the margins littered with symbols. Musicians still struggle to play it as written. Historians now believe it was designed never to be fully replicated, a puzzle meant for wartime ears. Above the manuscript, a note is pinned in Clara's handwriting. Asterisk, if my hands cannot strike, let them speak. Music remembers. Asterisk. The English Channel, ever grey and churning, hid more than U-boats and sea mines during World War II. Beneath its waves, in the cold waters between Dover and Calais, ran a lifeline that few knew existed, a covert cable surveillance network known as the Neptune Divide. And from a sealed bunker beneath Dover Castle, a deaf naval engineer named Lieutenant Oliver Muir listened to silence, and in doing so, helped win the Battle of the Atlantic. The Neptune Divide wasn't born out of grand strategy, but desperation. In early 1941, German U-boats were sinking Allied convoys with brutal efficiency. Intelligence from Enigma intercepts was vital, but not enough. British Naval Command needed real-time communication from the heart of the Channel, direct eavesdropping on U-boat transmissions. Thus, Operation Neptune Divide was born, an undersea cable rigged with hydrophones and experimental signal amplifiers capable of detecting faint Morse code and low-frequency chatter from submarines skimming beneath the waves. The cables had once carried telegraph messages between England and France before the war severed their use. Engineers and divers, operating under Royal Signals Command, repurposed them. They were rewired and connected to a listening station buried into the chalk cliffs beneath Dover, a forgotten armory sealed since the Napoleonic Wars. It was there that Lieutenant Muir, barely 30, with a thick notebook and a sharper mind, took his post. Muir had been born deaf after a childhood bout of scarlet fever. Where others saw disability, the Admiralty saw potential. He read lips perfectly, had an uncanny talent for pattern recognition, and could interpret radio wave frequencies by visual waveform alone. He hears with his eyes, his commanding officer once said. And he remembers what others miss. Inside the choir room, as the operators jokingly called the bunker, a series of large oscilloscopes, frequency monitors, and reel-to-reel recorders lined the walls. Muir worked alone during the midnight shift, where silence reigned and static hummed like ocean ghosts. What he searched for was noise, the rhythmic pulse of Morse, the ghost of a sonar ping, the hiss of submarine engines. He logged every anomaly with meticulous care, noting changes in frequency, duration, and origin. In January 1942, Muir identified a pattern no one else had noticed, a 3-tone burst that repeated every 41 minutes, barely above the noise threshold. It wasn't Enigma traffic, nor standard Kriegsmarine protocols. Cross-referencing with convoy attacks, Muir concluded that it was a homing signal, used by U-boat wolfpacks to triangulate positions in the dark. The tone was dubbed Signal Sturmhawk. Once decrypted, this discovery allowed Allied ships to jam or spoof the signal, luring U-boats into depth-charge traps. Within weeks, convoy losses in the Channel dropped by nearly 30%. Muir received no medal, no citation. His name wasn't even on the internal report. The choir room didn't officially exist. In the spring of 1943, Operation Neptune Divide was upgraded. A new experimental system was laid beneath the seabed, a cable laced with magnetometers that could detect metallic anomalies moving along the ocean floor. Muir was now supervising a small team of technicians, each sworn to secrecy, each operating on schedules designed to prevent identification. They rotated through code names: soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. That summer, the choir room intercepted a bizarre burst of scrambled German, a message repeated 3 times over 6 hours, filled with stammered phrases and partial coordinates. Muir pored over it for days. When the meaning became clear, he acted without permission. The signal was a distress call from a German U-boat, U-472, that had struck one of its own mines while attempting to intercept an Allied convoy. It was drifting near the Sussex coast, leaking fuel, partially submerged, and hoping for rescue. Muir alerted Royal Navy Command under the pretext of routine hydrophone irregularity. A minesweeper was dispatched. U-472 was captured with its crew alive, and on board was a new variation of the Enigma machine, the M4 Shark Rotor. Until that moment, British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had been blind to German naval movements. The capture reopened the door. The choir room's secrecy intensified. A second listening node was established near Weymouth. Muir was offered a field commission, a chance to lead from HQ. He declined. "The noise is different up there," he wrote on a note. "I know this silence better than my own heartbeat." By early 1944, the Neptune divide was being used to monitor all submarine activity approaching southern England. As D-Day approached, Muir and his team detected increased movement along the French coast, U-boats amassing near Cherbourg. The Allies deployed dummy convoys and false signal broadcasts to confuse them, allowing the real invasion fleet to pass largely unchallenged. On June 6, Muir listened to the channel for hours. He could hear the vibrations of hundreds of ships moving toward Normandy. He could also hear silence. The U-boats were not attacking. They were still chasing shadows. But Muir's last act was not one of detection. It was one of sabotage. In September 1944, German saboteurs disguised as Belgian refugees infiltrated the Kent coast. Their objective was to locate and destroy the cable junctions that powered the Neptune divide. One reached the outskirts of Dover and was caught carrying diagrams eerily close to the choir room's layout. Muir, aware of the breach, activated a burn protocol. He and a technician sealed the inner vault, torched the documents, and flooded the cable bay with seawater. The choir room's devices were fried. The network was dead, but the secrets lived on. Oliver Muir disappeared that night. No body was ever recovered. Some claimed he escaped to a submarine base in Scotland. Others said he returned to Brighton, living quietly under a false name. In 1967, a retired naval officer claimed he received an unsigned letter containing only one line: "Asterisk, the sea sang. I listened." Asterisk. Today, a steel plaque near the Dover cliffs marks a sealed tunnel entrance. It reads, "In memory of those who listened in silence, who turned the tide without firing a shot." Behind that plaque, beyond rusted doors and moss-covered halls, lies the choir room, gutted, still, and forgotten. But beneath the channel, the cables remain, coiled like old piano strings, waiting for a hand, or an ear, to hear them again. Now you've seen what was never meant to resurface. You've stepped through a crack in history, into a world where codes lived inside music, ghosts rewired time, and silence was sharper than steel. But the question isn't whether these stories were true, it's why they were hidden. Some knowledge doesn't sleep. Some secrets rot slower than others. And once you've opened the door, you never quite close it behind you.